When the Second World War erupted across Europe, the German Kriegsmarine possessed a weapon that would terrorize the Allied naval forces for years to come. These vessels were the Unterseeboot, commonly known as U-boats, and their commander-in-chief, Adolf Hitler himself, gave them a fearsome moniker that would echo through history. He called them the Wolves of the Atlantic, and for good reason. These submarines represented a new kind of warfare, silent and deadly, capable of striking from beneath the waves without warning and disappearing into the depths before their victims could mount any meaningful defense. The design of these machines was both elegant and terrifying in its efficiency. Built for one purpose and one purpose alone, they were meant to cut Britain's lifeline, to sever the maritime supply routes that kept the island nation alive. Britain, as Hitler and his naval commanders well understood, was utterly dependent on imports. Food, fuel, raw materials, munitions, everything the British war machine needed had to cross the ocean. If Germany could sink enough ships, if they could destroy cargo vessels faster than they could be replaced, then Britain would have no choice but to negotiate peace. The nation would be starved into submission without a single German soldier setting foot on British soil. In those early years of the conflict, this strategy appeared to be working with devastating effectiveness. The U-boats operated with an innovation that caught the Royal Navy completely off guard. Rather than hunting alone as submarines had done in the First World War, German U-boat commanders developed tactics they called Rudeltaktik, Wolfpack tactics. Multiple submarines would coordinate their attacks, communicating by radio, converging on convoy routes like predators encircling prey. When darkness fell over the Atlantic, when merchant ships believed themselves safest, that's when the wolves would strike. The results were catastrophic beyond anything the Allies had anticipated. Throughout the early war years, U-boats sent ship after ship to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Merchant vessels loaded with desperately needed supplies would be torn apart by torpedoes, their crews often having mere minutes to abandon ship before the cold waters claimed them. The statistics tell a story of carnage on an almost unimaginable scale. In total, these German submarines would sink approximately 2,700 Allied merchant ships during the course of the war. When you calculate the total displacement of these vessels, the number reaches 14 million tons of shipping sent to the ocean floor. For Britain, the situation grew increasingly dire with each passing month. Fuel supplies dwindled to dangerous levels as tankers exploded in pillars of flame. Food rationing became ever more severe as cargo ships carrying grain and meat never reached port. The British people tightened their belts and endured, but their leaders understood how precarious the situation had become. Warehouses stood half empty, reserves shrank to levels that would sustain the nation for mere weeks, and still the U-boats continued their relentless assault on the convoy routes. Back in Germany, the propaganda machine seized upon these victories with unbridled enthusiasm. State-controlled media trumpeted each sinking, celebrated each commander who returned to port with confirmed kills. The German people were told that their navy was winning what propagandists termed the tonnage war, a mathematical battle where success was measured not in territory conquered, but in tons of Allied shipping destroyed. The equation seemed simple enough. If German U-boats could sink vessels faster than British and American shipyards could replace them, then ultimate victory was merely a matter of time and persistence. The mathematics of those early years indeed seemed to favour Germany overwhelmingly. For every U-boat that failed to return from patrol, dozens upon dozens of Allied merchant ships were being sent to their doom. The exchange ratio was spectacularly lopsided. U-boat commanders became celebrities in the Third Reich, decorated with medals, featured in newsreels, their exploits recounted in breathless detail by radio announcers. Young men volunteered eagerly for U-boat service, drawn by the glamour of submarine warfare and the promise of glory. They had no way of knowing that this same service would eventually become the most lethal assignment in the entire German military. But warfare is never static, and the tide of battle was already beginning to turn even as German propaganda proclaimed unstoppable victories. The Allies were not passive victims, simply accepting their fate. British, American and Canadian naval forces were developing countermeasures, improving technologies, and learning bitter lessons from each convoy that ran the gauntlet across the Atlantic. The intelligence services achieved breakthroughs that would prove absolutely decisive. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working in conditions of utmost secrecy, made incremental progress against the German Enigma machine, the supposedly unbreakable cipher device that allowed U-boat commanders to communicate with each other and with their headquarters. The cracking of Enigma represented one of the greatest intelligence coups in military history, though its full significance would remain classified for decades after the war's end. Once the Allies could read German naval communications, the entire strategic picture shifted fundamentally. Convoy routes could be adjusted to avoid known U-boat patrol lines. Submarine positions could be anticipated rather than stumbled upon. The wolves that had hunted with such impunity found themselves being tracked in return, their movements predicted, their ambushes anticipated and circumvented. Technology advanced on multiple fronts simultaneously, each innovation compounding the difficulties facing German submarine crews. Radar systems, which at the war's beginning were massive installations suitable only for land-based use or the largest warships, were miniaturized through engineering breakthroughs to the point where they could be mounted on patrol aircraft. These airborne radar sets could detect a surfaced U-boat at considerable range, even in darkness or poor weather. Submarines that had once felt safe on the surface at night, recharging their batteries and making good speed to intercept convoys, now found themselves illuminated by searchlights and bombed from above before they even knew aircraft were nearby. The convoy escort vessels themselves underwent a revolution in capability. Early in the war, merchant convoys sailed with minimal protection, perhaps one or two elderly destroyers that lacked the equipment or training to effectively hunt submarines. By 1943, convoys crossed the Atlantic, surrounded by purpose-built escort vessels bristling with anti-submarine weapons. These ships carried ASDIC, the British sonar system that could detect submerged submarines by bouncing sound waves through the water. They were armed with depth charges that could be rolled off the stern or thrown to either side, creating patterns of underwater explosions designed to crush submarine hulls. They deployed Hedgehog mortars, weapons that fired multiple small charges in an arc ahead of the ship, detonating only on contact with a submarine rather than at preset depths. The change in fortunes was not gradual, but rather arrived with stunning rapidity. 1943 became the turning point, the year when the hunters truly became the hunted. The same U-boat crews that had once terrorized convoy routes now found themselves engaged in a desperate struggle for survival every time they put to sea. The systematic nature of Allied anti-submarine warfare cannot be overstated. It became a science, a methodical application of superior technology and numerical advantage that ground down the German submarine force with inexorable efficiency. Consider the predicament facing a U-boat commander during this period of the war. If he chose to surface his vessel at night to recharge batteries and make speed, radar-equipped patrol aircraft could spot his boat from miles away and attack before he could dive to safety. If he remained on the surface during daylight hours, visual reconnaissance aircraft would inevitably spot him and vector in bombers to attack. If he chose to remain submerged to avoid detection, his submarine crawled through the water at a pathetic few knots, slower than the slowest merchant ship. In this submerged state, the U-boat was effectively blind and deaf, its crew unable to see anything beyond periscope depth, unable to hear much beyond the immediate vicinity due to the noise of their own equipment. Meanwhile, above them, escort vessels would crisscross the area, their sonar operators listening for the telltale sounds of a submarine, ready to rain depth charges down upon any contact. The arithmetic of this new phase of the war was utterly horrifying for anyone who served in the German submarine service. Out of approximately 40,000 men who served on U-boats during the entire course of World War II, 30,000 of them never came home. Let that number sink in for a moment. 30,000 men dead. That represents a casualty rate of 75%. 3 out of every 4 men who volunteered for or were assigned to U-boat duty would die before the war ended. To put this in perspective, this death rate exceeded that of German infantry units fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, a theatre notorious for its savage brutality and astronomical casualties. The U-boat casualty rate even exceeded that of Japanese kamikaze pilots, men who flew on literal suicide missions with no expectation of survival. Service in the U-boat Waffe, the submarine arm of the Kriegsmarine, had transformed from a prestigious assignment to what amounted to a death sentence. The men who served knew this, their commanders knew this, and yet the boats continued to sail because orders were orders and Germany was fighting for its existence. Every patrol could be your last, and the odds suggested it probably would be. Veterans of multiple patrols were rare creatures, men who had survived through a combination of skill, caution, and sheer luck. These experienced sailors watched as each new group of recruits came aboard, knowing that most of these young faces would never grow old, that most of these men would die screaming in a steel tube at the bottom of the ocean. Even before the possibility of death in combat, life aboard a U-boat was an exercise in endurance and misery. These vessels were marvels of engineering, but they were never designed with human comfort in mind. The typical Type 7 U-boat, the most common variant deployed by Germany, measured approximately 220 feet in length and 20 feet in width. Into this cramped steel cylinder, the Navy packed 50 men along with all the equipment, weapons, supplies, and fuel needed for extended patrols lasting weeks or even months. Living conditions were medieval in their primitive discomfort. The air inside the pressure hull was foul beyond description. A nauseating mixture of diesel fuel vapours, human sweat, unwashed bodies, mould growing in every damp crevice, and the stench of the single toilet that 50 men shared. Ventilation was minimal at best, and when the boat ran submerged for extended periods to avoid enemy aircraft, the oxygen levels would drop to the point where men gasped for breath, and simple physical exertion left them exhausted. Fresh food was a luxury that disappeared within the first week of any patrol. After that, the crew subsisted on canned goods and whatever provisions could withstand the damp conditions inside the submarine. Bread grew mouldy within days, vegetables rotted, meat went rancid. Veteran sailors learned to scrape the mould off their food before eating it, accepting this as normal routine. Sleep was achieved through a system called hot bunking, where men working different shifts would share the same sleeping berth. When one sailor went on duty, another would climb into sheets still damp with the previous occupant's sweat, trying to snatch a few hours of rest in the narrow bunk. Bunks were stacked in tiers of 3, crammed into every available space not occupied by machinery or weaponry. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist. Men lived on top of each other, their every action visible to their comrades, their every sound heard by all. Modesty became meaningless in such confined quarters. When the boat ran submerged, as it increasingly had to do during the later years of the war, absolute silence was mandatory. Every crewman understood that noise could kill them all. The slightest sound, a dropped tool, a raised voice, even footsteps that were too heavy, might be picked up by enemy sonar and bring depth charges raining down upon them. Men moved like ghosts through the submarine, communicating in whispers or hand signals, cushioning any movement of equipment with rags, stepping carefully to avoid making the deck plates ring. The psychological strain of enforced silence for hours or days on end, of being unable to express fear or frustration except through facial expressions, wore down even the strongest personalities. And the depth charges came with terrible regularity. Allied escort vessels dropped more than 500,000 depth charges during the course of the Atlantic campaign. Each one was a steel drum packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosive set to detonate at a specific depth. When these weapons exploded near a submerged U-boat, the effect was devastating even if they didn't score a direct hit. The shock wave from an underwater explosion travels through water with incredible efficiency, and the pressure wave from a depth charge could crack a submarine's hull, buckle internal bulkheads, and injure or kill crew members even at considerable range. Survivors of depth charge attacks described an experience of pure terror unlike anything else in warfare. The crew would hear the escort vessel passing overhead, the rhythmic throb of its propellers growing louder and louder until it seemed to fill the entire universe. Then would come the splashes as depth charges were rolled off the stern or thrown from the sides. The crew would count seconds, waiting, knowing that within moments the sea around them would erupt in violence. The explosions, when they came, were deafening even through the thick steel hull. The lights would go out as electrical systems failed. Bolts would rattle loose from their fittings. Gauges would shatter, showering men with broken glass. Cork insulation would break free from the overhead and rain down like dirty snow. Water would spray through seams as the hull plating flexed under the pressure, and every man aboard would wonder if the next explosion would be the one that tore the boat apart. Many U-boats simply never resurfaced from these attacks, entombed forever with their crews at the bottom of the Atlantic. The ocean floor became a vast cemetery for these vessels and the men inside them. One veteran of multiple depth charge attacks later described the experience in words that haunt the imagination. He said it was like being buried alive in a coffin, helpless and terrified, waiting for the lid to cave in and crush you. The crew could do nothing but endure, huddled at their stations, listening to their boat groan and creak under the assault, praying that the hull would hold, that the escorts would give up the attack, that they would live to see another day. The industrial mathematics of the conflict were even more damning for Germany than the tactical situation. The Third Reich built 1,162 U-boats during the entire course of the war. This represented a massive investment of resources, skilled labour, and strategic materials. Submarine construction required precision engineering, specialised steel alloys, and components that couldn't be easily mass-produced. Each U-boat took months to build, and the rate of construction, while impressive by any standard, could never match the pace of Allied naval expansion. The Allies, and particularly the United States, with its vast industrial capacity, simply overwhelmed Germany through sheer productive power. America, Britain and Canada together built 5,000 escort vessels dedicated to protecting convoys and hunting submarines. 5,000 warships whose sole purpose was to kill U-boats. These weren't makeshift conversions or obsolete vessels pressed into service, but purpose-built submarine hunters equipped with the latest detection equipment and weapons. Additionally, the Allies deployed 22,000 aircraft to the anti-submarine warfare mission. 22,000 planes dedicated to finding and destroying U-boats. These included long-range patrol aircraft that could cover vast expanses of ocean, carrier-based planes that extended air cover far beyond the range of land-based aircraft, and flying boats that could spend hours searching convoy routes for the telltale wake of a periscope or the dark shape of a submarine running on the surface. Perhaps most devastating to German hopes was the American Liberty Ship program. These were emergency cargo vessels, designed for maximum simplicity and speed of construction rather than elegance or longevity. American shipyards perfected the art of mass production, building Liberty ships on assembly lines using prefabricated components and welding techniques that allowed construction to proceed at incredible speed. At the program's peak, American yards were launching a new Liberty ship every 42 days. Think about that for a moment. Every 6 weeks, another cargo vessel entered service, ready to carry supplies across the Atlantic. U-boats could and did sink Liberty ships in considerable numbers, but they couldn't sink them faster than American workers could build them. The mathematics simply didn't work. For every merchant ship sent to the bottom, another rolled down the ways to replace it. German commanders, even those most committed to Nazi ideology, had to face this reality. By 1943, the tonnage war was lost. The statistics were undeniable. Allied shipbuilding had caught up to and then surpassed the rate of sinkings. Every month, despite the best efforts of U-boat crews, the Allied merchant fleet actually grew rather than shrank. Meanwhile, U-boat losses climbed to unsustainable levels. Submarines were being sunk faster than new ones could be built and crews trained. The wolf packs were being hunted to extinction, and everyone involved knew it. German naval engineers attempted to develop countermeasures to create innovations that might shift the balance back in their favour. The most significant of these was the snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged just below the surface. This should have been a war-winning innovation, allowing U-boats to recharge batteries and make decent speed without having to fully surface and expose themselves to radar detection. In theory, a snorkeling U-boat was nearly invisible, just a small tube protruding above the waves, almost impossible to spot visually and presenting a minimal radar return. But the snorkel came too late to matter. By the time this technology was widely deployed to the U-boat fleet, Allied air patrols had made the Atlantic Ocean nearly impassable for submarines regardless of their capabilities. The seas were simply too full of patrol aircraft, too densely covered by radar surveillance, too thoroughly controlled by escort groups that knew their business. Even with snorkels, U-boats found themselves detected, hunted, and destroyed with depressing regularity. The technological edge had shifted irreversibly to the Allies, and no single innovation could change that fundamental reality. The psychological toll on U-boat crews during this period defies adequate description. These men were not stupid. They could calculate odds as well as anyone. They knew that 3 out of 4 of them would die. They read the casualty lists, saw the boats that sailed and never returned, attended memorial services for comrades who simply vanished somewhere in the Atlantic without even the dignity of a confirmed grave. And yet they continued to report for duty, continued to board their submarines and sail into what they knew was almost certain death. Letters written by U-boat crewmen during the latter part of the war often read like final farewells. Men in their 20s wrote to their parents, their wives, their girlfriends with the certain knowledge that they were saying goodbye forever. They spoke of never seeing sunlight again, of comrades who had vanished without a trace, of the cold, dark water that would be their grave. Some wrote with fatalistic acceptance, others with barely concealed terror. But all of them wrote as men who knew they were doomed. The psychological warfare of knowing you're going to die but not knowing when or how, of walking onto a submarine knowing the odds say you'll never walk off again, destroyed men's minds even before enemy action could destroy their bodies. By the final year of the war, the quality of U-boat crews had declined dramatically from the early days of veteran sailors and experienced officers. Germany was running out of trained submariners as casualties mounted, and the Kriegsmarine had no choice but to push recruits through abbreviated training programs and send them to sea with minimal preparation. Teenage boys, some as young as 16 or 17, found themselves assigned to U-boats after just weeks of instruction. They boarded submarines without really understanding what they were getting into, without the experience to appreciate how slim their chances of survival truly were. Officers who should have been still learning their trade found themselves in command positions because so many senior commanders were dead. One veteran officer, in a moment of brutal honesty after the war, admitted that by 1944 and 45, they were essentially sending boys to die in steel coffins, sacrificing them in a campaign everyone knew was already lost, but which continued because stopping would mean admitting defeat. The final irony of the U-boat campaign becomes apparent when you examine the total casualties on both sides. German submarines killed approximately 30,000 Allied merchant seamen and naval personnel during the course of the war. 30,000 men who drowned in the cold Atlantic, who burned in flaming oil slicks, who went down with their ships or died in lifeboats waiting for rescue that never came. But the U-boats themselves lost the exact same number, 30,000 German submariners. The hunter and the hunted suffered identical casualties. They share the same vast grave, the Atlantic Ocean, which holds the bodies of 60,000 men who fought and died in the struggle for control of the sea lanes. When the war finally ended in May of 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had commanded the U-boat fleet throughout the war and who had even briefly succeeded Hitler as head of the German state, issued orders for all remaining U-boats to surface, signal their positions, and surrender to Allied forces. It was over. Germany had been defeated, and there was no purpose in sending more men to die in a lost cause. But many U-boat commanders refused even this final order. They could not bear the thought of handing their vessels over to the enemy, could not stomach the humiliation of surrender after all they had endured. Instead, they scuttled their submarines, opening seacocks and flooding the ballast tanks, taking their boats down one final time and watching them slip beneath the waves forever. But whether scuttled by their own crews or sunk by enemy action, the ocean already possessed the story of the U-boat war. More than 700 submarines lie on the seabed of the Atlantic Ocean, scattered from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean, from the coast of North America to the waters off Africa. Some are in shallow water where divers can visit them and document their final resting places. Others lie in the deepest parts of the ocean, crushed by pressure into barely recognizable wreckage. Each one is a tomb, a grave marker for the men who died inside when fire, water, or depth charges ended their war in the most terrible way imaginable. Popular culture, particularly Hollywood films made in the decades after the war, has often portrayed submarine warfare as a kind of thrilling chess match, a duel of wits between submarine commanders and their opponents. Movies show submarines as places of camaraderie and professional competence, where skilled crews engage in battles of stealth and courage, where victory goes to the clever and the brave. There is certainly some truth in this portrayal. Submarine warfare did require intelligence and courage, and there were moments of clever tactics and hard-fought victories on both sides. But this sanitized, dramatized version of events leaves out so much of the reality that it becomes almost a lie. The truth of the U-boat war was slower, darker, and far more tragic than any Hollywood screenplay would dare to portray. It was weeks of mind-numbing boredom punctuated by moments of stark terror. It was living in conditions that would be considered inhumane for prisoners, let alone combat troops. It was the slow psychological erosion of knowing that death was not just possible, but probable, that the odds were stacked overwhelmingly against survival. It was watching your friends die, sometimes quickly in the sudden violence of a torpedo explosion or depth charge hit, sometimes slowly as a damaged submarine sank beneath crushed depth and water pressure collapsed the hull like a tin can. It was the horror of being trapped in a steel tube underwater, unable to escape, as fire consumed the oxygen or water filled the compartments, drowning men who clawed uselessly at hatches that would never open again. For the vast majority of German U-boat crews, World War II was not an adventure or a hunt or a glorious crusade. It was extinction, a slow, grinding destruction of an entire military branch that fought on with decreasing effectiveness until it simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. The men who served knew they were being sacrificed, that their deaths would accomplish nothing in the larger strategic picture, that the war was lost and their missions pointless. But they went anyway, because duty demanded it, because their comrades were going, because to refuse was unthinkable in the military culture of Nazi Germany. And so they died in their thousands, young men mostly, with futures that would never be realized and families that would never see them again. The Atlantic Ocean keeps their story still, preserved in rusting steel on the ocean floor, in bones that have long since been scattered by currents or dissolved by salt water, in the silence of dark depths where no light penetrates and where the pressure is so great that human bodies become unrecognizable. The wolves that once terrorized the convoy routes became victims themselves, hunted to near extinction by an enemy with superior technology, greater numbers, and industrial capacity that Germany could never hope to match. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity: 75% casualties, 30,000 dead, 700 submarines lost. Behind each number was a human being, someone's son or husband or father or brother, men who laughed and loved and hoped and feared, and who died far from home in circumstances of unspeakable horror. This was the reality of the U-boat war, stripped of propaganda and romanticism, examined through the cold lens of historical fact and the testimony of those few who survived to tell the tale. It stands as one of the most devastating examples of military attrition in modern warfare, a campaign that consumed the lives of tens of thousands of men on both sides and ultimately accomplished nothing that could justify such enormous human cost. The Battle of the Atlantic was won and lost through industrial capacity and technological innovation, not through the courage or sacrifice of the men who fought it, though they demonstrated both in abundance. In the end, the mathematics were inexorable, and mathematics do not care about bravery or dedication or willingness to die for a cause. The numbers simply add up until one side can no longer sustain its losses, and for the German U-boat service, that point came long before the war ended, yet the dying continued for 2 more years until final surrender brought the killing to a stop.